Patrick was grinding against this blonde girl's ass right in front of me at Slub last Saturday, making direct eye contact with me the entire time like some kind of psychopath who wanted me to watch him completely humiliate me in public. I'm sitting here typing this, and I'm still so pissed I can barely think straight. This man looked me dead in the eyes while he had his hands all over this random girl and said the most disgusting thing I've ever heard come out of anyone's mouth. Let me back up for 2 seconds because I know you're all thinking, why the hell was I even there in the first place? Patrick and I have been together for 9 months, and yeah, before you start typing it in the comments, I know that's not that long, but it felt serious. We moved in together after 4 months because his lease was up and I was stupid enough to think it meant something when he suggested it. My parents live about 2 hours away and I moved here for college, stayed after graduation. Patrick makes decent money, always talking about how he's got his shit together compared to other guys our age. He's 26, I'm 24, and he loves reminding me how much more life experience he has. Red flag number 1 that I completely ignored like an idiot. So last Saturday, Patrick decides we're going out with his work friends to celebrate some big sale he closed. I should have known something was weird because he spent forever getting ready, changing his shirt 3 times and using way more cologne than normal. When I asked if I looked okay in my black dress, he just shrugged and said I looked fine, which isn't unusual because Patrick never compliments me unless he wants something. We get to the club and immediately his whole vibe changes. He starts ordering drinks for everyone, acting like he's the king of the place, and keeps making these comments about how all the girls there are dressed like they're actually trying. Every time a waitress comes over, he's all smiles and charm, asking about their night, being super friendly. With me, he barely acknowledges I exist. About an hour in, I'm standing by our table talking to Cynthia from his work when Patrick walks up behind this blonde girl at the bar. She's wearing this tiny silver dress, and she's definitely gorgeous, I'm not gonna lie. But what happened next was so calculated and cruel that I still can't believe it actually happened. Patrick starts dancing with her, which whatever, we weren't exactly attached at the hip. But then he positions himself so I can see everything. And I swear he planned this whole thing because he keeps looking over at me while he's all over this girl. His hands are on her waist, then lower, and she's grinding back against him and clearly into it. The music was loud, but not loud enough that I couldn't hear him when he leaned close to her ear and said something that made her throw her head back and laugh. Then he looked directly at me and mouthed, "This is what a real woman looks like." I felt like someone had slapped me across the face. Cynthia saw it too because she grabbed my arm and said we should get some air, but I couldn't move. I just stood there watching my boyfriend of 9 months publicly disrespect me in the most humiliating way possible. But it gets worse. So much worse. After about 10 minutes of this show, the girl's friends came over and pulled her away to dance somewhere else. Patrick walked back to our table like nothing happened, ordered another drink, and when I tried to pull him aside to talk, he laughed and said I was being dramatic. I told him what he did was completely unacceptable and that I wanted to leave. Patrick looked at me like I had just said the dumbest thing he'd ever heard and said, and I quote, "Babe, you're too ugly to ever worry about me actually cheating. That was just dancing." The entire table went quiet. Cynthia literally gasped. His friend Raymond actually said, "Dude, that's harsh," under his breath. And Patrick just stood there smiling like he'd made some hilarious joke. I was so shocked I couldn't even respond at first. Then the anger hit and I said he needed to apologize right now or I was leaving without him. Patrick took a long sip of his beer, looked around at everyone staring at us, and said, "You should thank me daily that I even touch you. Look around this place and tell me you're competing with any of these girls." At this point, I was done. Done. I grabbed my purse and started walking toward the exit, but Patrick caught up with me and grabbed my wrist. He said if I left now, I was proving his point about being dramatic and insecure. He said the girl from the bar was watching and I was embarrassing him by making a scene. Then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He walked back over to where the blonde girl was standing with her friends and brought her over to me. He introduced me as his girlfriend and told her I was upset about their dancing. The girl looked super uncomfortable and said she didn't realize he had a girlfriend there. Patrick told me to apologize to her for making things weird because she was just having fun and didn't deserve to get caught up in my insecurities. He stood there waiting for me to actually apologize to this random girl for being upset that my boyfriend was grinding on her right in front of me. I looked at this girl, who seemed nice enough and clearly had no idea what kind of psychopath she'd been dancing with, and I actually did it. I apologized. I told her it wasn't her fault, and that I was sorry for the awkward situation. She was sweet about it and said she hoped we worked things out, then quickly walked away with her friends. Patrick acted like he'd just solved world peace. He put his arm around me and said, "See, that wasn't so hard. Now let's enjoy the rest of the night." But I was done pretending everything was normal. I told him I was calling an Uber and going home. Patrick said fine, but that I was overreacting and making our relationship weird over nothing. He said he'd talk to me when I calmed down and could have an adult conversation. The Uber ride home was 20 minutes of me sitting in the backseat crying and replaying everything that happened. I kept thinking about how he planned it, how he positioned himself so I could see, how he brought that girl over to make me apologize. It was like he wanted to break me down as much as possible in front of everyone. I got home and sat on our couch waiting for him to come back so we could have it out properly. Patrick rolled in around 3 a.m., drunk as hell, and acted like I was crazy for still being awake. He said we'd talk in the morning when I wasn't being emotional. Sunday morning comes and Patrick gets up, makes himself coffee, and sits down like nothing happened. When I brought up Saturday night, he sighed like I was bothering him with something trivial. He said he was sorry I got upset, but that I needed to understand the difference between dancing and cheating. He said if I couldn't handle him talking to other women, I wasn't mature enough for a real relationship. I told him it wasn't about talking to women, it was about grinding on someone while telling me I'm too ugly for him to cheat on. Patrick rolled his eyes and said he was trying to give me a compliment by letting me know I don't have to worry about other women. He said most guys would never tell their girlfriends they're safe from competition because it might hurt their feelings, but he respects me enough to be honest. I asked him how calling me too ugly is a compliment, and he said I was twisting his words. He said what he meant was that he chose me for who I am, not just looks, and that I should appreciate having a boyfriend who values personality over superficial things. He said the girl at the club was probably boring, and that he'd rather be with someone real like me. This man really sat there trying to convince me that publicly humiliating me was actually him being a good boyfriend. I told him that even if that's what he meant, which I don't believe for a second, making me apologize to that girl was completely out of line. Patrick said I made the situation uncomfortable for everyone, and that apologizing was the mature thing to do. He said it showed I could take responsibility for my actions instead of always playing the victim. Patrick kept saying I was making everything about me when he was just trying to have fun with his friends. He said if I couldn't handle going out together without getting jealous and possessive, maybe we should reconsider some things. Every time I brought up specific things he said or did, he claimed I was remembering it wrong or being too sensitive. By the end of the conversation, Patrick had somehow turned the whole thing around so that I was the problem. He said he'd forgive me for embarrassing him at the club if I promised to work on my jealousy issues. He suggested maybe I should talk to someone about why I get so insecure when he interacts with other women. I just stared at him. This man had spent 2 hours gaslighting me into thinking I was the crazy one for being upset about what happened. I told him I needed space to think about everything, and that maybe he should stay at his friend Luther's place for a few days. Patrick laughed and said I was being dramatic again, but that if I needed time to cool off, he could arrange to stay somewhere else. He packed a bag like he was doing me this huge favor and said he hoped I'd be ready to have a rational conversation when he came back. That was 4 days ago, and I haven't heard from him since. No calls, no texts, nothing. I've been going over everything that happened, and I keep finding new things that piss me off, like how he made sure his work friends saw everything, how he brought that girl over specifically to humiliate me more, how he spent Sunday morning acting like I was insane for being upset. But here's what's really eating at me. I keep thinking about what his ex might have gone through and whether he's done this kind of thing before. I found myself wondering if this is just who Patrick is, or if something about me makes him think he can treat me like garbage. I called my best friend Haley yesterday and told her everything. She was furious and said I should pack his stuff and leave it outside. She said no decent man would ever humiliate his girlfriend in public like that, and that making me apologize to the other girl was psychological abuse. First update. I thought what happened at the club was bad, but Patrick came back yesterday and I found out so much more about what kind of person I've been living with for the past 5 months. First off, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. So Patrick showed up at our apartment like nothing had happened, just walked in with his bag and started putting his clothes back in the dresser like he'd been gone on some casual business trip instead of disappearing for 4 days after publicly humiliating me. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard his key in the lock, and honestly, I wasn't ready for the conversation we needed to have. But seeing him just stroll in like that pissed me off all over again. I asked him where the hell he'd been and why he hadn't called or texted once since Sunday. Patrick looked at me like I was being unreasonable and said he told me he was staying at Luther's place to give me space to cool down. He said he figured I needed time to think about my reaction at the club and get my emotions under control. The way he said emotions made it sound like I'd had some kind of breakdown instead of a normal human response to being treated like garbage. I told him we needed to talk about Saturday night because I'd spent 4 days thinking about it and I was even more upset than before. Patrick sighed and said he hoped I'd use the time to gain some perspective, but that he was willing to discuss it if I could be rational. That word rational set me off. I asked him what exactly was irrational about being hurt when your boyfriend grinds on another girl while telling you you're too ugly for him to cheat on. Patrick said I was already starting off on the wrong foot by exaggerating what happened and putting words in his mouth. Then we got into this huge back and forth where Patrick kept insisting I was remembering things wrong or taking them out of context. Every specific thing I brought up, he had some explanation for why it wasn't what I thought. When I mentioned him making me apologize to that girl, he said I chose to apologize because I realized I was being unfair to her. When I brought up him saying I was too ugly to worry about, he said I was twisting a compliment into an insult. But here's where it gets really interesting. During this argument, Patrick said something that made me realize he's been playing mind games with me for months. He said I have a pattern of getting upset over nothing, and that maybe I should consider why I'm so insecure in our relationship. I asked him what he meant by pattern, and Patrick started listing off times when I'd apparently overreacted to things. Like how I got weird when he talked about his attractive coworker Molly, or how I made a big deal about him commenting on some girl's Instagram photos, or how I got jealous when he mentioned going to lunch with his female friend Chelsea. The thing is, I barely remembered any of these incidents because at the time they seemed so minor. But Patrick remembered every single one and had been keeping track of my jealous behavior for months. He said it was concerning that I couldn't see the pattern myself and that maybe I needed to work on my self-esteem issues. As he's listing all this stuff, I'm realizing that Patrick has been testing me this whole time. All those little comments about other women, all those times he'd mention how attractive someone was or how much fun he had hanging out with female friends. He was watching to see how I'd react, and then using my reactions as proof that I was the problem. I told him it felt like he'd been deliberately trying to make me jealous, and then criticizing me for feeling exactly what he wanted me to feel. Patrick said that was ridiculous and that he's just an outgoing person who gets along well with women. He said if I had a problem with him having female friends, or noticing when someone was attractive, that was my issue to deal with. Patrick never once acknowledged that what he did at the club was wrong. Instead, he turned the whole thing into an analysis of my character flaws and how my jealousy was damaging our relationship. By the end of the conversation, he was suggesting I might benefit from talking to someone about my insecurity problems. Patrick said he loved me and wanted to make things work, but that I needed to take responsibility for my part in our problems. He said relationships require trust, and that if I couldn't trust him to interact with other women without getting possessive, we had bigger issues than one night at a club. I went to bed that night feeling so confused and frustrated. Patrick had this way of making everything sound reasonable when he said it, but something felt really off about the whole conversation. I kept thinking about how he'd planned that whole thing at the club, how he'd positioned himself so I could see, how he'd brought that girl over to humiliate me more. Wednesday morning, I woke up still feeling unsettled. Patrick was already up making coffee, and he acted like our conversation the night before had resolved everything. He was in a great mood, being affectionate and talking about plans for the weekend like nothing had happened. But then, something weird happened while Patrick was in the shower. His phone was charging on the nightstand and it kept buzzing with notifications. Normally, I would never look at his phone, but after everything that had happened, I was curious who was texting him so early in the morning. I picked up his phone and saw a bunch of Instagram notifications and text messages. The phone was locked, obviously, but I could see previews of some of the messages on the lock screen. There were several from people I didn't recognize, including what looked like messages from girls saying things like, "Had fun last night," and "Thanks for the drink." My stomach dropped when I saw a message preview from someone named Brianna that said, "She has no idea, does she, LOL." I stared at that message preview for like 30 seconds trying to figure out what it meant and who this Brianna person was. When Patrick got out of the shower, I asked him who was texting him so early. He said it was probably just work stuff and notifications from social media. I mentioned seeing a message from someone named Brianna and asked if that was someone I should know. Patrick's whole demeanor changed immediately. He got defensive and asked why I was looking at his phone. I said I wasn't snooping, just that it kept buzzing and I could see the message previews on the lock screen. Patrick said Brianna was just a friend from college and that the message was probably about some inside joke. But the way he said it didn't feel right. Patrick grabbed his phone and quickly unlocked it, turning away from me while he checked his messages. When I asked what the joke was about, he said he couldn't remember and that it wasn't important. The rest of Wednesday was tense. Patrick was on his phone more than usual and kept angling it away from me when he was texting. Every time I tried to bring up our conversation from Tuesday night or ask more questions about what happened at the club, Patrick would change the subject or say we'd already talked about it enough. By Wednesday evening, I was feeling like I was going crazy. Patrick was acting like everything was fine while I was still processing this whole thing about him tracking my jealous behavior and this mysterious Brianna person. I decided to call my friend Haley again to talk through everything. Haley listened to me explain the whole conversation with Patrick, and she was even more pissed than before. She said it sounded like Patrick was gaslighting me, and that keeping track of my reactions to test me was manipulative as hell. She said normal boyfriends don't deliberately make their girlfriends jealous, and then blame them for feeling jealous. But then Haley said something that really got to me. She asked if I'd ever looked at Patrick's social media posts about me, or about other women. I realized I hadn't really paid attention to what Patrick posted online because I don't use Instagram or Facebook that much. Haley suggested I check out his profiles to see if there were any red flags I'd missed. She said sometimes guys reveal their true attitudes about their girlfriends in what they post online or what they comment on other people's posts. Thursday morning, while Patrick was still asleep, I decided to look at his Instagram. I'd never really scrolled through his posts before, but what I found made me feel sick to my stomach. Patrick's Instagram was full of photos with attractive women. Lots of group shots from parties and work events where he was always positioned next to the prettiest girls. Photos from the gym where he was clearly flexing for the camera. Shots from bars and clubs that I didn't even know he'd been to. But what really bothered me were his comments on other women's photos. Patrick was constantly commenting on his female friends' pictures with things like gorgeous as always and fire emojis and damn girl type comments. He was way more active on these women's posts than he'd ever been on mine. I scrolled back through months of his posts and realized Patrick had only posted a handful of photos that included me. And in most of them, I was barely visible or looked terrible compared to the other people in the picture. Meanwhile, he had dozens of photos highlighting other women or himself looking single and available. The worst part was reading through his comments and seeing how flirty he was with so many different girls. Patrick was constantly hyping up other women's appearances while he'd never once commented anything remotely romantic or complimentary on any of my rare appearances on his social media. I was sitting there looking at months of evidence that Patrick didn't respect me or value our relationship, at least not publicly. His Instagram made it look like he was single or at best casually dating around. There was no indication that he was in a serious relationship with someone he loved and respected. Right as I was scrolling through more of his comments, a DM notification popped up on my phone. It was from Patrick's friend Luther, the same Luther whose place Patrick had supposedly been staying at all week. Luther's message said, "Hey, can we talk? I think there's some stuff about Patrick you should know." I messaged Luther back and said yes. I wanted to talk. He asked if we could meet up somewhere in person because what he had to say was too important for text messages. We agreed to meet while Patrick was at the gym. I spent the whole morning nervous as hell about what Luther was going to tell me, but also feeling like I was finally going to get some clarity about the situation I'd been living in. The meetup with Luther is happening in a few hours, and honestly, I'm terrified but also relieved that someone else might have answers about Patrick's behavior. Based on everything I found on his social media and the way he's been acting since he came back, I'm starting to think the club incident was just the tip of the iceberg. I'll update you guys after I talk to Luther. Second update. Girls. I am shaking right now and I don't even know where to start. The meeting with Luther happened and you were all right about Patrick being a complete psychopath, but it's so much worse than I thought. So I met Luther Thursday afternoon while Patrick was supposedly at the gym. I was nervous as hell walking in there because part of me was still wondering if maybe I was overreacting to everything, and Luther was going to tell me Patrick was just misunderstood or something. Luther was already there when I arrived and he looked really uncomfortable, like genuinely stressed out about whatever he was about to tell me. He asked if I wanted to get coffee first, but I was too anxious to wait, so I just sat down and asked him what was going on. Luther started by saying he'd been debating whether to tell me any of this for weeks, but after what happened at the club Saturday night, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. He said he felt responsible because he'd been enabling Patrick's behavior by not speaking up sooner. Then Luther told me something that made my stomach drop. He said Patrick had been planning what happened at the club for over a week, like literally planning it. Patrick had told Luther and some of his other friends that he wanted to put me in my place because I'd been getting too comfortable in the relationship and needed to be reminded of where I stood. I asked Luther what the hell that was supposed to mean, and he said Patrick had been complaining about me for months. Apparently, Patrick thought I was getting too clingy and possessive and that I needed to be knocked down a few pegs. The whole thing at the club with that blonde girl wasn't some spontaneous moment of disrespect. It was a calculated plan to humiliate me in front of everyone. Luther said Patrick had specifically chosen that club because he knew there would be attractive women there. He'd even scoped out the place the weekend before to plan exactly how he was going to execute this whole thing. Patrick had told his friends he wanted me to see him with someone who actually looked like girlfriend material, so I would understand the difference. I was sitting there trying to process this information, and Luther kept going. He said Patrick had been talking about me differently to his friends for months, not like someone he loved and respected, but like I was some kind of project or temporary situation he was dealing with. According to Luther, Patrick had been telling people that I was good practice for when he found someone he actually wanted to be with long term. He said Patrick literally called me his practice girlfriend and would rate me compared to other women he met. Luther said Patrick had told him multiple times that I was maybe a 6 on a good day, but that dating me was helping him figure out what he really wanted in a serious relationship. At this point, I was feeling sick, but I needed to hear everything. Luther said Patrick had group chats with some of his friends where they would rate women they met or saw on social media. Apparently, Patrick had sent photos of me to this group chat and asked for ratings, then shared the results with everyone as proof that he could do better. Luther pulled out his phone and said he'd been screenshot some of the conversations because he knew I wouldn't believe how bad it was without seeing proof. He showed me messages from a group chat called The Boys, where Patrick had sent a photo of me from last month when we went to dinner for my birthday. The messages were brutal. Patrick had captioned the photo, "Rate my practice GF," and his friends had responded with numbers between 4 and 6. But the worst part was Patrick's response where he said, "Exactly what I thought. She's a solid 3 on her best day, but she's easy to control and doesn't question anything I do." I stared at Luther's phone reading these messages, and I wanted to throw up. These grown men had been rating my appearance like I was some kind of object, while my boyfriend laughed along and contributed his own cruel commentary about how controllable I was. Luther kept scrolling and showed me more messages where Patrick had shared details about our relationship that were completely private. He'd told these guys about arguments we'd had, things I'd confided in him about, even intimate details about our physical relationship. Patrick had been treating our entire relationship like entertainment for his friends. But the absolute worst message was from just a few days ago. After Patrick came back from staying at Luther's place, Patrick had written, "Mission accomplished, finally put her in her place. She's questioning everything now and walking on eggshells, exactly where I need her to be." I looked up at Luther and asked if he'd been part of these conversations, and he said he'd been in the group chat but never participated in the rating stuff. He said he'd told Patrick multiple times that what he was doing was messed up, but Patrick would just laugh it off and say I'd never find out, so it didn't matter. Luther said he'd been thinking about telling me for weeks, especially after seeing how Patrick talked about the club incident like it was some kind of victory. But what finally pushed him over the edge was seeing a conversation Patrick had with someone else that made Luther realize how deep Patrick's manipulation really went. Luther showed me screenshots of text messages between Patrick and some girl named Anne. The messages were from earlier this week, right after Patrick came back to our apartment. In the texts, Patrick was bragging to Anne about how he'd broken me down at the club and how I was now completely under his control. Patrick had told Anne that making me apologize to that blonde girl was the best part of the whole night because it proved I would do anything to avoid losing him. He said he'd been testing my boundaries for months to see how much I would tolerate, and that the club incident was his way of establishing complete dominance in the relationship. The messages with Anne were so clinical and cold, like Patrick was discussing a business strategy instead of talking about someone he claimed to love. He wrote about how he'd been deliberately making me jealous and insecure so that I would be grateful for any attention he gave me. He said his plan was working perfectly because I was now questioning my own reality and desperate to prove I wasn't the jealous, dramatic person he'd convinced me I was. Anne had responded asking if Patrick felt bad about manipulating me like that, and Patrick had written back, "Why would I feel bad? She chose to stay. Every time I test her boundaries and she accepts it, that's on her. I'm just giving her what she's willing to take." I was crying by this point, not just from sadness, but from pure rage. Luther handed me some napkins and said he was sorry he'd waited so long to tell me, but that he hoped it wasn't too late for me to get out before Patrick did any more damage. Luther said there was more I needed to know. He told me that Patrick had been seeing other women throughout our entire relationship. Not just flirting or emotional affairs, but actually cheating with multiple people. The girl from the club wasn't random. Patrick had been texting with her for weeks, and they'd hooked up before. According to Luther, Patrick had a rotation of women he would see when I thought he was working late or hanging out with friends. He'd been using our apartment when I was at work or visiting my parents. Luther said Patrick had even brought women to places we went together regularly, like our favorite restaurant, and would post about it on social media to see if I would notice. Luther showed me Patrick's Instagram messages with several different women, all of whom Patrick was leading on by pretending to be single or casually dating. He'd been telling these women that he was in between relationships or seeing someone casually who didn't mean much to him. The Brianna person whose message I'd seen the other day was apparently someone Patrick had been hooking up with regularly. Her message saying, "She has no idea, does she LOL?" was about Patrick bringing another girl to some party they'd all been at together while I was supposedly at home sick with a headache. Luther said Patrick had been living essentially two completely different lives. With me, he was the committed boyfriend who was just trying to work through normal relationship issues. With everyone else, he was single and available, constantly talking about how he was planning to end things with his practice girlfriend as soon as he found someone worth actually dating. I asked Luther why he was telling me all this now, and he said watching Patrick humiliate me at the club had been the last straw. He said Patrick had been getting more cruel and calculated in his manipulation, and Luther was worried about what Patrick might do next if I stayed with him. Luther also told me that Patrick had been planning to break up with me after his lease renewal came up in a few months. Apparently, Patrick had been using me for cheap rent and domestic support while he shopped around for someone he actually wanted to be with long-term. He'd been telling his friends that I was convenient for now, but that he had no intention of staying with me once he found a real girlfriend. The most disgusting part was that Patrick had been taking bets with his friends about how long it would take him to completely break down my self-esteem. Luther showed me messages where Patrick was bragging about how insecure he'd made me, and how I would probably beg him not to leave me when he was ready to move on. After 2 hours of Luther showing me months of evidence that my entire relationship was a lie, I felt completely numb. Everything Patrick had said and done suddenly made perfect sense. The way he tracked my reactions, the way he made me doubt my own feelings, the way he positioned our arguments so that I was always the problem. It had all been deliberate psychological manipulation. Luther said he'd been carrying around this guilt for months about not speaking up sooner. He said he'd tried to distance himself from Patrick after seeing how cruel he was being, but that Patrick would just find other friends to share his manipulation tactics with. I thanked Luther for finally telling me the truth, even though it was devastating to hear. Luther said he had screenshots of everything and that I should keep them in case I needed proof of what Patrick had been doing. He said he was worried Patrick would try to gaslight me even more once I confronted him about any of this. I left, feeling like my entire world had been turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about Patrick and our relationship was completely false. I'd been living with a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an easy target for his psychological games. The drive home was brutal because I had to face the fact that I was going to have to confront Patrick about everything Luther had shown me. But I also felt this strange sense of relief, because finally everything made sense. All those times I'd felt like I was going crazy or overreacting, I'd been right. Patrick had been deliberately manipulating me the entire time. I got back to our apartment around 6 p.m. and Patrick was already home from the gym, making himself dinner like nothing had happened. He asked how my day was and if I'd done anything interesting, and I just stared at him thinking about how he'd probably been texting other women all afternoon while pretending to work out. I told Patrick we needed to have a serious conversation, and he immediately got that condescending look on his face like he was preparing to manage another one of my emotional outbursts. He said he hoped I'd had time to think about our discussion earlier in the week, and that I was ready to acknowledge my part in our relationship problems. That's when I lost it. I told Patrick I knew about the group chat where he'd been rating me and calling me his practice girlfriend. I told him I knew about the women he'd been cheating with and that I knew the whole club incident had been planned to humiliate me. Patrick's face went completely white and then immediately red. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked actually scared instead of smug and controlling. He started stammering and asking where I'd gotten that information, demanding to know who I'd been talking to. I told him it didn't matter where I'd heard it because I had proof of everything. Patrick immediately switched into damage control mode and started denying everything, saying whoever told me those things was lying and trying to cause problems in our relationship, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Part 4 coming soon because this story is far from over and you guys are not going to believe how this all ends. Last update, I cannot believe what went down over the past few days. Patrick has completely lost his mind, and I am dying laughing at how pathetic he's become. When I left off, I had just confronted Patrick about the group chat and all the cheating I'd found out about. Patrick's face went from smug to terrified in about 2 seconds, and that's when I knew everything was completely true. Patrick immediately started panicking and trying to convince me that whoever told me these things was lying and jealous of our relationship. He kept demanding to know who had shown me the messages and where I'd gotten my information. I pulled out my phone and started reading him his own messages from the group chat. The one where he called me a solid 3 on my best day but easy to control. The messages about me being his practice girlfriend. All the ratings and nasty comments about how I looked. Patrick kept trying to deny it was him at first, then said I was taking everything out of context, then finally admitted they were real, but claimed he was just talking trash with the guys and didn't mean any of it. He kept asking who had access to his private messages and how they'd gotten to me. That's when I told Patrick I also knew about Brianna and Anne and the blonde girl from the club and all the other women he'd been hooking up with. Patrick went completely pale and started stammering about how those were just friends and that I was misunderstanding innocent conversations. But then I dropped the real bomb. I told Patrick I knew about his regular hookups with his boss's wife. Patrick literally went white as a sheet and started stuttering like he was having a stroke. I had screenshots of Patrick bragging to his friends about this married woman whose husband happens to be the director at Patrick's company. Patrick had been sending detailed messages about their affair, including photos and videos this woman had sent him, plus specific times and places they'd been meeting up. The messages were graphic and had this woman's full name, photos of her face, even screenshots of her telling Patrick about her husband's business trips so they could plan their hookups around his schedule. Patrick had basically documented his entire affair with his boss's wife in explicit detail. When I mentioned her name, Patrick looked like he was going to pass out. He immediately forgot all about trying to figure out who my source was and started begging me not to do anything with those screenshots. He promised he'd do whatever I wanted if I just deleted everything and never mentioned it to anyone. I looked at this pathetic man who'd spent months making me feel worthless and said, "Oh, now you're worried about consequences. Interesting how that works." Patrick tried every trick in the book. He said I was violating his privacy. He said whoever gave me this information had betrayed his trust. He said I was being dramatic and that all relationships have problems. But when I brought up his boss's wife again, all his confidence just crumbled. I told Patrick he had exactly 1 hour to pack his stuff and get out of my apartment, because the lease is in my name since his credit sucks. And for the first time in our entire relationship, Patrick didn't argue with me. He just nodded and started throwing his clothes in a bag like his life depended on it. The whole time he was packing, Patrick kept asking what I was planning to do with the screenshots and begging me to tell him who had given them to me. I just smiled and said I hadn't decided what to do yet, but that I'd definitely be keeping them somewhere safe. Patrick looked like he was going to throw up. He kept saying he needed to know who was sharing his private messages so he could handle the situation, but I just laughed and said that ship had sailed when he decided to document his affair in explicit detail. Before he left, Patrick tried one last desperate plea. He said he was sorry, and that he'd made terrible mistakes, but that ruining his career wouldn't change anything. He said if I really loved him, I wouldn't destroy his life over some stupid messages. I laughed right in his face and told Patrick that his life was already destroyed. He'd done that all by himself. I said I wasn't planning to ruin anything, just keeping my options open in case he tried to bother me again. Patrick packed up and left that night faster than I'd ever seen him move. No threats about me regretting it. No claims that I'd come crawling back. Just pure panic about what I might do with the evidence of his affair. Friday morning, I woke up feeling amazing. I changed the locks and started throwing out all his leftover crap. But the best part was watching Patrick try to figure out how to get back in my good graces without actually admitting what he'd done wrong. He started sending me these desperate texts about how he'd made mistakes but that we could work through anything together. He said he'd delete all his social media and cut off all his friends if I'd just promise not to share those screenshots with anyone. I ignored every single message, which apparently drove Patrick absolutely insane. By Friday evening, he was texting me constantly, alternating between pathetic apologies and barely contained panic about his career. Saturday morning, Patrick showed up at my building, buzzing my intercom over and over. When I finally answered, he was practically crying, asking me to just talk to him for 5 minutes. He said he knew he'd messed up, but that destroying his job wouldn't make me feel better. I told Patrick through the intercom that I wasn't destroying anything. I was just existing with knowledge of his choices. If his choices might destroy his career, that sounded like a him problem, not a me problem. Patrick started getting desperate and saying he'd do anything I wanted. He'd pay me money, he'd publicly apologize, whatever it took to make this go away. I told him the only thing I wanted was for him to leave me alone and stop buzzing my intercom, or I'd call the police. Sunday morning, Patrick started calling me from different numbers since I'd blocked his main one. The voicemails were absolutely pathetic. In one message, he was literally crying, asking me to please just tell him what I wanted from him. But the best voicemail was Patrick saying he understood why I was angry, but that revenge wouldn't make me happy in the long run. He said destroying his career would make me just as bad as he'd been, and that I was better than that. I actually called him back after that message. When Patrick answered, he sounded so hopeful, thinking I was finally going to talk to him. I said, "Hey Patrick, just wanted you to know, I'm not getting revenge on you. I don't need to destroy your career. You already did that yourself when you decided to document your affair with your boss's wife in explicit detail and share it with your friends for entertainment. I'm just aware of your choices now." Patrick started stammering about how it wasn't what it looked like and begging me not to ruin his life over a mistake. I told Patrick his life wasn't my responsibility, it was his. If he was worried about consequences, maybe he should have thought about that before creating a digital trail of his affair. I hung up before Patrick could respond and blocked his new number too. Monday morning, I woke up to find he'd made 3 different fake Instagram accounts to try messaging me. The messages were completely unhinged, begging, asking what he could do to make this right. But honestly, you guys, I want to be clear about something. I know some of you might be expecting me to expose this affair to her husband, and I get why that seems like justice. But I found out this woman has a 2-year-old kid, and I'm not about to be responsible for potentially destroying some innocent child's family. That's between her, her husband, and her conscience. I'm not going to be the one who blows up their marriage and affects their kid just to get back at Patrick. Her husband deserves to know, but that's not my story to tell. What I am doing is letting Patrick drive himself insane, wondering what I might do with what I know. And honestly, watching him panic about his own choices while knowing I have all the power in this situation is way more satisfying than any drama I could create. The funniest part is that I haven't even done anything with those screenshots. I'm just existing knowing what I know, and Patrick is creating his own personal hell, wondering what I might do. He's completely lost control of the narrative he spent months crafting. It's been a week since I kicked Patrick out, and I feel like a completely different person. I'm sleeping amazing, I have energy again, and instead of walking on eggshells, I'm walking around knowing that karma caught up with him in the most poetic way possible. My friend Haley came over yesterday and I showed her some of Patrick's desperate messages. We were crying, laughing at how pathetic he's become. Haley said she'd never seen someone panic so hard about the consequences of their own actions. Patrick spent months making me question my reality and feel lucky that someone like him would even touch me. Now he's begging that same person not to expose what kind of man he really is. The tables have turned so hard, it's almost funny.